Well, he clearly is setting the stage for a clash because he tweeted that remark about that comment from the French president being insulting, he said, minutes after he touched down on French soil, despite the fact that President Macron made that remark over a week ago during a French radio interview. So the president waited until he was here to make that remark, to say he believed that was insulting. And essentially, he seemed to be setting the stage for what could be a contentious meeting between the two leaders here today. As you see, President Trump seems to be arriving here. There he is, pulling up now. We could hear the two of them make remarks as they do climb the steps before they do go inside. They're going to meet one-on-one at the beginning of this for about 25 minutes or so. That's what's on the schedule for right now. And then they will bring their staffs in for a much longer, extended bilateral meeting. A meeting that we expect to talk about the United States' decision to withdraw from the INF treaty, something that was the reason that sparked those comments from the French president, saying that in light of that, he was putting a renewed focus on European security. There,
Caitlin,
the two leaders are shaking hands now.
let me interrupt you for a second. We're now seeing the live footage of the French leader Emmanuel Macron.
S'il vous plaît.
All right, let's bring in Melissa Bell, who's also covering the story for us. She's right there in the palace, and you can talk more about what you've witnessed when these two gentlemen came face to face after the dust-up leading up to this meeting. Melissa.
Well, we have watched so closely this relationship as it's evolved, Natalie, from what had been an attempt at friendship, or at least a dialogue, or at least the beginning of a conversation from the French president, and which has soured so much over the course of the last few months. Once again, they meet here in Paris. This is, of course, the second time that Emmanuel Macron has welcomed the American president to the French capital. But just consider how much has changed since July of last year. There was the handshake there, and Emmanuel Macron guided the American president to the top of the steps there at the Elysee, as is customary, and sort of insisted on waiting for a moment in front of the assembled press. Now, we hadn't expected either of them to address the cameras at that point, but we are, Natalie, hoping to hear from at least the French president over the course of the next few minutes as they sit down to that bilateral. There should be cameras in there for a few minutes, and we have been told to expect him to answer to speak to that tweet, the one that was sent 2 minutes after the arrival of Air Force One last night, directly. So we'll be looking to see what tone the French president takes. He's been fairly clear, even when he was seeking to establish that warm relationship to begin with. He's always been very plain speaking and free, and painting himself as a man who is diametrically opposed to Donald Trump in terms of his vision of the world and almost all of the issues that are likely to come up today. Natalie.
Right, and as you were speaking, we saw Mr. Macron seeming to want to perhaps reach out to Mr. Trump, shake his hand, but he patted his arm instead, and they both gave two thumbs up, so a little bit of a different look on their greeting. Have we heard at all from the government or any officials there on what they think sparked Mr. Trump's tweet, and perhaps how he may have taken it out of context?
Well, Natalie, for now, the Elysee have refused to make any comment on it. We reached out repeatedly since the tweet was made to get their reaction, and that's what we're likely to get directly from the French president himself today in front of those cameras. But clearly there is a sense here in Europe that there's been some sort of misunderstanding on the part of the American president. The quotes that Emmanuel Macron made, what he said on Tuesday to French radio is something he said repeatedly, that given the changing world, given the aggression on the part of Russia, and the fact that former alliances that had for so long ensured NATO countries' security seem to be being tested in part by the American president, that it was important that Europe should coordinate and build up its own defense forces. This is nothing new. It was simply taken out of context by the American president with that tweet that we saw yesterday. So with any luck, an answer shortly.
Yeah, Melissa, we're looking at video that's speaking right now. Let's listen.
I'm very delighted to be able to host President Trump once again for an exchange visit after our discussions in Brussels, Paris, and that particularly, of course, on the occasion of the 14th of July 2017, and my visit to Washington, New York, at the UN General Assembly, and also because we're here to celebrate the triumph of our peoples and the extraordinary solidarity between us as the oldest allies of the world. We also have a lot of topics in common to talk about: Syria, the international agenda in general, Africa as well, and obviously I'm going to share with President Trump my views about the strategic capability of Europe taking more of a part within NATO, of course, to defend itself, and I'm extremely glad to be able to host President Trump and his First Lady, and we will be dining together tonight.
After a very important time in your domestic policy, I do appreciate the fact that you came here, Donald, after your visit for Bastille Day in 2017 and our state visit in Washington beginning of this year. I think it's very important to celebrate our soldiers and the great solidarity between our two nations. And we are the best and more ancient allies. And this is what I told our people. Obviously, we will discuss about a lot of topics: Iran, Syria, Yemen, Africa, trade, climate, and a lot of common global issues. And obviously we will discuss about as well our defense cooperation, which is very important. And I do share President Trump's views that we need a much better burden sharing within NATO. And that's why I do believe that my proposals for European defense are totally consistent with that, because it means more Europe within NATO, more capacity, in order to take our part of the burden. And I think it's very fair and it's very important. So thanks very much, Donald, for being here. This is our pleasure, and our people are very proud to have you here. And I want to thank you here today for your solidarity 100 years ago and your constant solidarity for precisely our people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, I very much appreciate that, Mr. President, and we have become very good friends over the last couple of years. We have much in common in many ways, perhaps more ways than people would understand, but we're very much similar in our views, and I appreciate what you're saying about burden sharing. You know what my attitude's been, and we want a strong Europe. It's very important to us to have a strong Europe, and whichever way we can do it the best and most efficient would be something that we both want. I just want to thank you very much for the graciousness. We were so beautifully received. We were so beautifully received last night. We look forward to spending the next day and a half with you. And today and tomorrow are going to be very important. And we'll be discussing many things, not only military and aid and NATO and others, but we'll also be discussing trade. And we've been discussing that for a little while. I think we've made a lot of progress. We'll see if we can get it over the line, as they say. We'll see what happens, but trade is very important. And we're also very much focused, the President and I, on terrorism. Terrorism is a very big subject for both of us. And we see what's going on in the world, and it's not a good picture. But we've made a lot of progress. We've done things together that were quite bold recently, 6 months ago, very bold. And terrorism will be a big factor and a big part of our discussion today. So I want to thank everybody for being here. And Mr. President, thank you very much.
You say you felt insulted by what Mr. Macron said about Europe making its own defense. Can you explain?
We're getting along from the standpoint of fairness, and I want it to be fair. We want to help Europe, but it has to be fair. Right now, the burden sharing has been largely on the United States, as the President will say, and he understands that. And he understands that the United States can only do so much in fairness to the United States. So we've We're rebuilding our military. We just had approved $716 billion. The year before that, we had $700 billion. So we're almost completely rebuilding our military with the latest and the greatest. And we want to absolutely be there. We want to help. We want to be a part of it. But different countries have to also help. That's only fair. And I think the president, we've already discussed this, and the president and I very much agree on that.
I do agree. I think we work very closely together in Syria. President Trump reminded you what happened the 13th of April this year. We worked very closely together to make a superb operation against chemical weapons used there. And we work very closely together in Middle East, in Africa, and so on. But it's unfair to have the European security today being assured just by the United States, and we need a much better burden sharing. That's why I do believe that we need more European capacities, more European defense, in order to take this part of the burden. What President Trump has to protect or to defend one of the states of the United States, he doesn't ask France or Germany or another government of Europe to finance it. That's why I do believe that we need more investment. It's exactly what we do in France. It's the first increase in terms of budget for defense for the coming years. We will reach the 2%. But that's why I do believe that we need more European defense in this framework. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, you've been watching President Emmanuel Macron. He is hosting currently his U.S. counterpart, Donald Trump, at the French presidency, the Élysée Palace. That's in central Paris. So they're going to have a one-on-one meeting that's going to last about 25, 30 minutes. Then they will have another 30 to 40 minutes of meeting with their teams and their advisors. After that, the first ladies are scheduled to arrive at the Élysée Palace, and the two presidential couples will have lunch there before parting ways. Caitlin Collins, our White House correspondent, she's at our Paris bureau. She's been listening in on this. Caitlin, I'd like your take on this. To me, this is kind of surreal, because this trip started with a spat between Mr. Macron and Mr. Trump over defense spending, how much Europe was going to take part in its own defense. And when I listen to them, I don't hear that much disagreement between their viewpoints.
You could see that interaction right there, very different than what we typically have seen between President Trump and President Macron, which has been a very chummy relationship, smiles, slapping each other on the back, that kind of interaction that we typically see from the two of them. But that is not what you witnessed right there while they were both speaking. Now, Macron certainly seemed to be working to get the president's ear there by saying words like burden sharing. That is something that the president has long complained about, especially when it comes to NATO, saying that all the countries need to be using 2% of their GDP for their military. That has long been a complaint of his, and you could see Macron trying to tap into that there. But then President Trump was not making eye contact with the French president while he was speaking about European defense. Now, those are the comments that irked President Trump and caused him to send that tweet last night, just minutes after he arrived here in France. And of course, that comes in response to what Macron said during a radio interview after the United States that it was going to withdraw from the INF treaty. That is that nuclear arms control pact that President Ronald Reagan signed with Russia back in the 1980s. And President Trump has said recently he's going to withdraw from it. But Macron's problem is he says the biggest person who is going to be the victim of that is Europe and its security. And that is why he made those responses about building up military defense here, something that clearly bothered President Trump. But Macron continued to make the argument there, saying that he still believes they need to do that. But he also brought up burden sharing as well. Now, this kind of gives you a flashback back to when President Trump was in London. He was going to meet with the British Prime Minister Theresa May over the summer, and hours before they met, he gave this interview where he criticized her, praised some of her biggest political rivals, and then set up this awkward meeting between the two of them. That seems to be what we're witnessing here between the American president and the French president, and President Trump setting a very different tone than his national security advisor, John Bolton, who arrived in Paris ahead of him and was praising an American-European alliance in the days that he's been here. not exactly what we're hearing from President Trump. Now, the two of them are going to meet one-on-one. They'll likely go into that further, and then their staffs will come in, and they're going to discuss a slew of issues, as you heard from both of them there. Not only military and defense, but also Syria, Yemen, those Iranian sanctions that have been renewed, that have been something that have irked the French president as well. A slew of topics, but you have to question what the tone of that meeting is going to look like after President Trump has essentially set them up for a clash.
Especially, Caitlin, if you compare it to the body language from their last meeting back in April, back in Washington. There was so much touching, backslapping. There was so much public displays of affection and friendship. It is a very different tone today. All right, Caitlin Collins reporting live from our Paris bureau. Thank you.
Let's go back to Melissa Bell. She's right outside the palace there where they just met. And you did get a sense, Melissa, that Mr. Macron was trying to reach out to President Trump and perhaps smooth things out, but Mr. Trump didn't seem to be having much of it, really. So here they go from here.
That's right, Natalie. As reaching out to his arm, almost trying to cushion the blow that he was expecting. Already, this was a relationship that had become much testier after that visit that Cyril just mentioned to the United States by Emmanuel Macron, since that was still, you'll remember, the period when the French president was hoping to reason with his American counterpart on the question of trade tariffs towards Europe. After that, the fact that the United States decided to reimpose those tariffs really marked a rupture, a break in what had been a warmer than usual relationship. That is, Emmanuel Macron had managed to construct something that resembled the beginning of a relationship where so many other leaders had failed or hadn't bothered to try. So this was already a testier relationship. It was already being challenged on key issues on which the French presidency simply hadn't managed to get any movement, any reciprocity from the American government, from the American administration, any compromise. And of course, then we've seen in the context of what was already going to be slightly more tense, we expected a far more belligerent tone from the American president ever since those midterm results towards the press with regard to what's happening in Florida. And as he landed here with regard to Europe. And of course, Emmanuel Macron very much couching precisely what he's been saying for months about European defense in a language that Donald Trump can understand. It is about burden sharing. There is nothing at all for the United States to be worried about, quite the contrary. We hope to get a sense perhaps later of what the two men have managed to talk about on the substance, and in particular, you heard Donald Trump there before their bilateral meeting began saying that trade would be high up there on the agenda. It was a very important subject. Will Emmanuel Macron get any of that compromise he's looking for on it? That's a big question, but from what we've seen these last few months, we're considering that fairly unlikely.
Melissa Bell, thank you so much. We appreciate your analysis. We'll, of course, continue to cover this story and, of course, the events marking the end of World War I 100 years ago. Thank you.
President Emmanuel Macron is welcoming world leaders who are in France this weekend for events marking the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended fighting in World War I. Jim Bitterman is at our Paris bureau. Jim, of course, we were waiting to see what that initial handshake and those initial words would be like, those initial moments between Mr. Macron and Mr. Trump, given that this visit by the American president didn't get off to the best start. No sooner had he got off Air Force One than he tweeted that he felt insulted by the French president's words. What did you make of their first few minutes together?
Well, it looked cordial as far as we could see, but, you know, one of the things, just to put this in this whole dust-up in a little bit of historical context, Cyril, you know that Mr. Macron, I'm sure you know this well, read it, considers himself the great fan and follower of Charles de Gaulle. He considers himself a Gaullist. In fact, just last month, he visited de Gaulle's hometown, Charles de Gaulle, who was president of France right after the war and onwards, and always believed in a very independent France. And you'll remember Charles de Gaulle inspired and created the Force de Frappe, which was France's own independent nuclear force, apart from anything the United States had or any of the other NATO allies. And he also expelled NATO in his bid to maintain France's independence. So in that regard, what Macron had said last week and what happened in this little dust-up this morning is quite in line with what France's position has been almost since World War II. Sure.
Jim, tell us about the ceremonies tomorrow. This is a huge deal for Mr. Macron. He's spent I mean, his staff has spent more than a year preparing this, the 100th anniversary of the end or the end of the fighting in World War I. What's that going to be like?
Well, I think it's going to be solemn, but it's also going to be a celebration of peace. And it's also going to be the start of this Paris Peace Forum, which is something, again, an idea of Mr. Macron's to bring the world together. He's going to have more than 70 heads of state and government here who are gathering for this. And the Peace Forum itself begins right after the ceremonies tomorrow. There's a lunch, and then the Peace Forum opens. It's going to go on for 3 days. They're going to talk about how to improve world infrastructure, things like the United Nations, for example, how to make it work better, and the ways that people can cooperate better to maintain a peaceful world. And I think he'd like to see this become some kind of an annual meeting or some kind of a peace process that's sustainable. The government has very much been galvanized to accommodate all of these leaders that are coming into town. Huge security operation to protect them all. It's a great party being given by the French, but it has very serious motives in that they would like this to be an ongoing thing that can be connected with France and will go on for years to come. Cyril?
All right, Jim Bitterman is just after 11:30 a.m. local time in Paris. Jim, speaking from our Paris bureau, thank you very much.